Wait for it, and we're live. Hail, you crazy sci-fi and fantasy fans. It's time for your daily dose of shenanigans over here at the Blasters and Blades podcast. Just a couple of nerdy veterans and one chaos coordinator geeking out over our science fiction passions and fantastical fantasies, a place where magic is king, the sky is the limit, and space is the place. We are the podcast that puts the fun in dysfunction. So without further ado, I'm going to warn you now and warn you once. We are unsupervised. You have two history nerds, and the Garbers couldn't make it, so it's their fault if this goes awry. But with that, Dale, could you introduce yourself to our listeners and viewers at home?
Yeah, I'm Dale Cozort, author of lots and lots of mostly alternate history novels and novellas and short stories.
Outstanding. And I love me some alternate history. So, all right, before we dive in too deep, first I will have to tell you how we found him, because you always want to know that, dear listener. He actually found us because we interviewed, I think it was it Bill Fawcett that we interviewed that you found us?
S.M. Sterling, I believe.
Okay, it's Sterling. So he reached out to us, and then, we're off to the races. With that, before we get started with the fun stuff, you do have to answer the religion questions. Are you ready for this?
I think so, yeah.
All right. Star Wars, Star Trek, or Firefly?
Firefly.
Okay, what is it about Firefly that you love?
I think the dialogue is really good. At its best, it has a really really interesting world. It's kind of and I think kind of a reasonable world in that you got a basic you got a lot of terraforming with a basic package of crops and animals, things that'll reproduce on that world, so they don't have to keep importing food, and they don't have to deal with machines breaking down and getting spare parts and all that sort of stuff. So it naturally it's a reasonable thing for them to have kind of a Western feel to the outer moons, the less developed moons, and I think that's one of the parts of it. But I think the key is the personalities and the dialogue. Really, Josh Whedon does really good dialogue.
So the homesteading in space, then, is what you like?
Yeah.
Would we call that space steading?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, it's your basic terraform to make the thing habitable. Then you drop off a package that, and biology does the rest. You don't have to build machines. They just naturally reproduce themselves.
Absolutely.
So.
Works for me. And it makes traveling there, getting a colony started, because once you have its sustainable population, then you can start bringing in the ability to manufacture and expand from there.
Yeah.
That makes sense. All right. And because we are polytheistic here at the Blasters and Blades podcast, Game of Thrones, The Wheel of Time, or Chronicles of Narnia?
Oh, brother. Chronicles of Narnia, maybe. Although I think I would like Game of Thrones. My problem is that I watch most of my TV with my wife, and she does not like violence. So Game of Thrones, I have to watch it on my own, where in the kind of little small spaces of time. I think I would probably like it a lot, except I hear for this final season, which I think everybody thinks is pretty much garbage.
Okay, that's fair. And yeah, you got to keep the wife happy, so that makes sense. All right.
Yeah.
One of the crying shames of adulthood is they stop asking the important questions. So, Dale, what is your favorite dinosaur?
I think I would go with a Tyrannosaurus, because it goes all out. I mean, the thing is, okay, you're going to use your mouth to kill things, and you're going to use your legs to get there. So what do you need these little arms for? So you just shrink them down to almost nothing, and it's a committed animal. It just, the mouth is where it's at. as far as yeah, I'm not really a big dinosaur fan. They're kind of it's almost like um, when I was okay. We went through our dinosaur phase in about fourth grade actually, and my one of my best friends was making clay models of dinosaurs and knew all the names and all that sort of stuff. I was more into early man. I just fascinated by the yeah by what they knew back then, which of course was uh, mostly obsolete now. They knew about Neanderthals and Java Man and Peking Man, but they didn't really know how the Australopithecus types of things went fit in. Uh, but I was fascinated by the way that humans evolved more so than dinosaurs. Uh, but we were fascinated by all kinds of fossils, and we one of our teachers was nice enough to let us take maybe about a third of the playground's rocks into the classroom because we thought they were fossils. We saw little indentations and imagined that we were seeing real things there. Uh, it was a lot of fun. We had I think I had pretty much in a lot of ways, an ideal childhood because we had these. The school district had just enough people for for two classes of a grade, and then they had a half of another one. So they the uh, put two grades together, and they put a really experienced teacher who knew the yeah knew that if kids got excited about something, you just stepped out of the way and let them go. So we could we geeked out on just about everything. Some of the and it was just like geek thing of the month, I guess. And some of it wasn't really all that geeky. We went through a phase where every guy in the class was uh, we played basketball, and we were determined we were going to play basketball every day of the school year. And it didn't matter, Midwest, Northern Illinois, it gets brutal sometimes during the winter. I mean, we're talking sleet, snow, 6 inches of snow on the ground, and wind chill factor 20 below. We would be out there before school and at recess, and we'd have special rules where we didn't have to dribble because we couldn't. There was snow on the ground, but we could run until we stopped, and then we had to pass the ball off. And I remember the thing I remember most about that was a basketball. When it's cold, it feels like it's like catching a rock. There's no flexibility at all. So you'd hit that, and your fingers would just ooh the. But yeah, that passed about. I'm surprised we didn't die of pneumonia, but ironically, I didn't miss a single day of school that year. Uh, but that passed, and then we went into stamp collecting. Uh, we had a little fad one time where everybody had to have a garter snake. Yeah, it was the thing. If you're anybody, you had a garter snake, and we had one of them. We had them in the classroom. I brought mine home, and my mom said, "Oh, no, that thing is not going to come here." Uh, so, but I remember one of them got loose in They had these enclosed radiators, and one of them got loose in the radiator, and we couldn't figure out how to get it out. So it just stayed there until it got hot enough. The heating season started. It got hot enough that the snake wanted out of there. We finally got clothes hangers down enough that we could get it under it and then lift it up. I don't think that the teacher ever. I don't think administration ever knew that snake was loose and living in the heating season. So yeah, I mean, it was a fun time. We would we went through a phase of stamp collecting. Everybody had their own stamp collection, Of course, the fossils and the uh, clay dinosaurs. And it was a good time. There's one guy in the class who is kind of he was kind of the designated decider of cool, and he if he decided something was cool, it was cool, no matter how nerdy it was. Now, stamp collecting, yeah, it's cool. Okay, then it's cool, and everybody was into it, and it's kind of in a way that was kind of that's kind of the antithesis of being a nerd, but kind of follow the leader. But when the leader is sort of half nerd, then I guess it kind of works out that way. Yeah. So
Nice. So finally, as we wrap up these religion questions, because we are civilized human beings here at the Blasters and Blades podcast, we are no longer knuckle dragging troglodytes. Coffee or tea, and how do you take it?
Oh, brother. Yeah. Okay. Well, I don't drink coffee at all. Sorry, I'm kind of knuckle dragging on that regard. I do drink tea sometimes, but my drink of choice, and I may get thrown off the podcast for saying this, is kombucha.
What's kombucha?
It's kind of a brewed tea,
Okay.
fermented. It's horrendously expensive, unfortunately. I got turned on to it by a friend that did it herself, but I don't have that kind of don't have the patience or skill to do it, so I buy it. It's got a live culture in it. It's like a cross between tea and yogurt. I don't know. I don't know quite how to describe it. Only certain flavors though. There are some that taste like they ought to be coming out instead of going in. To be honest. So,
yeah. Is that herbal tea or is it a black tea?
well, it's let's see. I don't. Do I happen to have a bottle around here someplace? It's like I say, it's fermented. It has to remain chilled because the culture in there. If it's warmed up, it'll start uh, generating a alcohol content.
Nice.
Let
me warm that baby up.
Yeah, there are some things that there are some versions that'll have like a couple percent alcohol, and so you have to, if you take it up there and the cashier's under 21, they have to get another cashier. You never know that until you're up there because it's a trivial amount of alcohol, like 1 or 2%, but still.
Yeah, I don't know. Like for me, I'm from the South, so tea should be only drank one way, iced and sweet, thick enough to hold the spoon up. We call it table wine. Okay. Basically, it's diabetes in a cup. And the only other acceptable answer, as someone who grew up in revolutionary America, is the only other way to drink tea is out of the harbor.
Okay, there you go. I do drink tea sometimes when the kombucha isn't around. The way I do it, it's I don't know, it's almost masochistic. I get an unsweetened tea, and then I put just enough sugar packets in it to give it a little bit of sweetness.
That works. So we talked about a little bit that you write alternative history. So let's start with the history part. So how did you discover your love of history?
Well, I had an uncle who is fascinated by American Indians, and he was actually stationed during World War II down in Panama, and he was an old hillbilly, and he hooked up with some Indians down there that were still pretty wild. They the Cunha Indians in Panama, and he was hunting with them and hanging out with them during his time off of base. And he got fascinated with the culture, and he would tell all kinds of stories. When we visited down there, he'd tell all sorts of stories about times with the Indians, and he had a little museum out back uh, with arrowheads and other, you know, momentums, mementos of the Indians, and so that was kind of the start of it. Uh,
So, is there any one era that fascinates you the most?
oh gosh, you know that depends on the time on uh, it's whatever I got interested in last. I guess I fascinated by every aspect of World War II, and especially the wide the big interflows of power between the theaters. I think when you read a history of World War II, you'll see there's they're the ones that focus on the Pacific. They're the ones that focus on the uh, Mediterranean, and then they're the ones that focus on either the Eastern or Western Front. But the reality was that there's a lot of interplay between those theaters. I mean, you look at why did it take so long uh, for Britain to firm up its position and against Hitler? Well, part of the reason was that there was that Japan was being really really nasty in the lead up to World War II. There was an incident. Have you ever heard of the Tianjin incident? I may be butchering the pronunciation of that.
Um, it sounds familiar, but enlighten us.
Okay. Well, what it amounted to is that the British had an enclave, a kind of a trading enclave in China, and some nationalist Chinese who the Japanese accused of, I think it was possibly assassinating one of their people. I forget exactly what caused the incident, but the Japanese decided they were going to blockade uh, entrance to this enclave. And not only that, but they were going to strip search anybody that came in and out of that enclave. And the British were like, "Oh, no, you're not." And things got really, really tense. This was in, I think, around July,
June of
August.
39.
Oh, what's that again?
It was June of 39. I just Googled it.
Okay, yeah. So, so they were, yeah. There's a lot of there's a lot of remnants of the old yellow peril thing going on in the British mines, and there was a serious chance of a war over that. And so they had to worry about the Japanese, and uh, that that affected their ability to be as strong in terms of Europe as they really would have liked to have been. And ironically, the Japanese, who were probably, yeah, they were putting pressure on, and there was a faction that really wanted war with Britain at this time, but uh, they had a border incident with the Soviets between Manchuria and Siberia. At Kalkan Gol, I believe is the name of the place, but it was a major skirmish. Uh, I believe there were like a couple of Japanese divisions and like 5 Soviet divisions. Uh, Air raids, yeah, it was a minor war along that, but it was restricted to that one border area. And the Soviets kicked the Japanese butt. I mean, just very, very thoroughly. And the Japanese were like, oh, maybe we ought to pull in our horns. We've already got a war in China. The Soviets just proved that they can kick our butts. Maybe we shouldn't be starting a war with the English along with or the British along with that. So yeah, so you see that kind of connections. I'm fascinated by that sort of thing. Uh, I'm also fascinated by the by technology, by the way that technology interplays with with power, military power. For example, uh, the Germans were really, really lucky in that they started building, mass producing aircraft at a time that the main technology for fighter planes was in um, transition. Uh, in 1935 or 36, Poland had one of the best air forces in the world. Really, they had high wing monoplane, the gull wing planes, and those things were considered top notch. But by 1939, they were totally obsolete. They were 50 or more miles an hour slower than the modern monoplanes, which were low wing monoplanes with a retractable undercarriage. So the Germans started mass producing right at a time when their mass production made almost anybody who didn't keep up with it obsolete. Now, Poland didn't keep up with it. France, Czechoslovakia also didn't. They had some very nice biplanes, biplane fighters, but they had their monoplane fighters. They were in October 1938. They were still at the prototype stage for their first low-wing monoplane. And France, in October 38, they had no fighter plane that was competitive with a Me-109, not a single one. They would have one that was sort of competitive by December of that year. But yeah, they only had planes that were about 50 miles an hour slower and just totally not competitive. And that had to weigh on their minds when they were looking at, are we going to go to war over Munich? Now, fortunately, ironically, the Germans had their planes, but their pilots were not really up to snuff. They as of October 1938, their pilot training was nowhere near, competitive. Their pilots were still mostly untrained. Now Britain competed. They had competitive planes with the Germans. The Spitfires and the Hurricanes were pretty competitive. So it's that sort of thing where so there was a window of opportunity for the Germans to they could, when they produced fighters, they were obsoleting everybody else. Now that wasn't their first generation of fighters. The first generation of German fighters were after when they started rearming were biplanes and not particularly good ones. But when they started mass producing, they mass produced good stuff.
So, to your point, we were talking about the Tientsin incident, and I'm probably butchering it too. So there were actually two Tientsin instances. The one in 1931 was June looked like it was June, but that was where they were trying to place Paiui on the throne in Manchuria.
Okay.
And then the one in 39 was the incident you discussed, and the one in 39 went from June 14th, 1939 to August 20th.
Yeah.
So my guess is they pick the dates based on weather in the area, so it makes sense that both happen around the same time.
Okay. Yeah. I hadn't really heard of the 31 one in 31, but you see how that how the stuff over in the stuff that doesn't seem to fit together. It had that influence. The British had to.
And it's not just the. I mean, between World War I and World War II was a transitional period in warfare. So World War I, it was all about, holy crap, we got the machine guns, or the Vickers guns, or whatever, the Browning. Right. And that was a game changer from war that was, we had gone in lines. And then the lines didn't work because of the machine gun, and suddenly we went back to what we would think of as small unit movement tactics now that we might have considered skirmish only up to that point. And then between World War I and World War II, and obviously the gas warfare, which thankfully we haven't hardly used since.
Yeah.
And then after that, between World War I and World War II, not only did they invent the plane, They also had because obviously the plane was in World War One, but they also had during World War II the revolution from transportation being animal driven to machine driven. So you ended up with the kind of creation of what we would consider modern tanks. Obviously, they had the pillbox type tanks in World War One, but it was still in transition. There were many nations that still had horse cav at the start of World War II, and so that was being revolutionized as well.
Right.
I think the U.S. was already working on replacing the horse with the tank completely at the start. During that era, I don't think we had many horse units left, but I do know there are some incidences that I want to say the Polish charged on horseback a Russian or German position.
They sort of did. It was the Polish cavalry. They had a lot of cavalry, but they weren't really cavalry charge type cavalry. They were
Lancers.
more dragoons, and they were actually more effective than the Polish foot soldiers because they or made infantry because they could move at night and then fight during the day. Whereas, what the incident that you're talking about, as I recall it, the Polish were they were basically trapped into charging tanks. It wasn't policy. It wasn't intention. It was this. They were caught, and well, you could either die or you could charge, and which way are you going to do? You know.
So there was the U.S. had our last horse charge was January 16th. I just googled it real quick. 1942, the 26th Cav Regiment of the Filipino Scouts charged the Japanese position, but those were essentially federalized militia, so that kind of makes sense.
Yeah.
And the terrain was more suited for that. I mean, even today, vehicles have trouble navigating those terrains. But the one I'm thinking about was the charge of the Savoia Cavalleria at Izbushinski, which was the Italian cavalry, 600 Italian cavalrymen charged the 2,000 Soviet foot soldiers. That's what I was thinking about.
Oh, okay. I thought you were.
And you were mentioning the Polish one, which is the one you mentioned, but I was getting them confused, was the charge at Krojanti, which was the Polish cavalry charge. So there were three kind of prominent cab charges in World War III, but they were on the descendancy. And then you don't really see horse in action again until probably Afghanistan with the special forces in the early aughts.
You know, I was talking to a guy that fought in the Korean War, and he claimed, I have no other basis other than his claim, that at one point in the Korean War, they were in their line, and they were like, "What the hell is that sound?" I mean, I'm sorry, don't know if
you're fine.
Okay. And that sounds like a cavalry charging. And sure enough, it was cavalry. I don't know, some Chinese or North Korean group just riding toward them on horseback. And they didn't get close. I mean, it was just like, okay, first the artillery goes to work on them. And if any of them made it close enough, then the machine guns start working on them. It was just totally futile, but apparently, according to him at least, it happened.
So the only thing I could find about horses being used in Korea was the Outpost Vegas, which was where the war horse Sergeant Reckless, that was the horse's name, made a bunch of trips carrying wounded to the rear and then ammunition to the front.
Yeah. Well, I can't vouch for this guy's story. He was just kind of, even after all the, this had to have been, he was close to retirement age, so it had to have been like 30 more years later. He was just shaking his head about why in the world would anybody try that even? But I had an uncle in Korea that he had some stories. I don't know. By the time I talked to him, he was in the process of dying of prostate cancer and pretty morphined up. But so I don't, can't verify anything beyond the fact that he was in Korea and in an infantry division, during the Korean War. But he was talking about what's that?
Yeah, I've heard some stories. I had a great uncle that was a Marine at the Frozen Chosen, and I have grandfather that landed on D-Day. So like I grew up with those stories too. It's kind of crazy to think about. And then how warfare was different from my own deployments to Iraq in 03 and 05.
Mm-hmm.
So it's some things changed. Others. I mean, I don't know. I guess I kind of feel lucky that I didn't have to do some of the stuff they had to do because at least we could weather the elements a little better than they did.
Yeah.
Modern clothing technology has kind of come a long way. So, but yeah, that's the cool thing for me is like I studied colonial American history. I growing up, I grew up in the South. So like I was always fascinated with the Civil War, or as they prefer to call it, the War of Northern Aggression or the War of Secession. Yeah. Technically, it's not actually a civil war. A civil war involves two factions of a country fighting each other for dominance. This was actually one faction fighting to keep the other faction from leaving. So purely semantically, it was a secession or secession. But anyway, it's known colloquially as a civil war. But I grew up like hearing the stories. I had a neighbor who had a flag with 49 stars on it. He actually cut one star out because West Virginia was not a state. It was part of Virginia, and he refused to accept the separation that happened during the outbreak of the Civil War. I mean, it's memory runs deep. And I kind of, on the one hand, that sounds shocking, but then you realize we paid the last Civil War pension out in like 2019 when that orphan died. So it sounds like a long time, but it's not as long as it sounds generationally. And then when I was going to undergrad and in grad school, I realized that's a very played out field as far as academia goes. Everybody and their brother's written books on it. So I'm like, well, I can study medieval history because that's cool because I learned about the Masons and like the escape tunnels and castles. And I'm like, that sounds cool. But then I had to learn a foreign language. And I'm like, I barely speak English. And not only would I have to learn like German or whatever, I have to learn the ancient version because it was German, French, or Italian would have been the languages I needed. But I wouldn't have to just learn modern Italian, modern German, modern. No. I got to learn Middle English or Old German or like, nope. So I was like, oh, I can study the American Revolution. No one's really written as much about it. And I can speak English. I'm good. So I ended up focusing on the American Revolution. But part of that, I think the inspiration for me, at least, was like I grew up reading Harry Turtledove, which we talked about in the pre-show, his Guns of the South, and the idea of like the average Civil War rifleman. I think a good soldier was getting 6 rounds a minute, up from like the before that. Even Civil War it was only 6, and the Revolution I think was 4 with a musket. Don't quote me on those numbers. And they basically, the premise of the Guns of the South is this racist South African group that left before apartheid became an issue to make sure it never happened by coming and helping the South win the war. So they had that slave state. And they did it by bringing AK-47s back to the Civil War. And the average AK could fire more. And again, math's spotty. I haven't looked these numbers up in years, but I remember thinking the average one AK could do as much as probably a company of period infantrymen could fire in a minute. Like it was a force multiplier immensely. And so I started like the idea of what if you change this one thing has always been fascinated with me. Like, I mean, even the military does that. There's that old problem that the war colleges teaches officers. And the idea is you take the 3rd Marine Expeditionary Force and you send them back to the middle of Rome at its height. Who wins in a fight? Of course the modern soldiers win. But modern warfare is built on the concept of shoot, move, and communicate, right? Like you've got to be dynamic movement. Even if you assume every bullet equals 1 kill, they would run out of bullets before the Romans ran out of soldiers. And then at that point in time, the Romans win. I mean, if you look at like Cannae, Cannae, the Battle of Cannae, I'm probably butchering the pronunciation. I used to be better at pronouncing before I lost some hearing. But I mean, they lost whole legions, and then they just redrafted and were like, okay, let's go round 2. It's so like they had no problem bleeding in ways that modern sensibilities just can't stomach.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it's always fascinating to think about it. So for you, what is it specifically about alternative history that speaks to you? Is it changing the one thing? Is it involving modern elements into the past? Like, because all of those qualify as alt history.
Yeah. Right. Okay, boy, I do all sorts of things. I have a little essay called "The Confederate High Wheeler Dragoons," and the idea behind it is that bicycles get invented. Well, they were historically invented, I think, late 1860s, early 1870s. But I pushed that back to pre-war, and I had the South. Had them invented in the South, and they become a big thing with bike races, macho things. The high wheelers, those absurd bikes with a huge front wheels and little back wheels, actually made sense because uh, they didn't have the chains and gears and everything like that. So the way to go fast was to have a big wheel. As long as so they had these huge front wheels, and it actually took a very athletic man or woman to get on one of those things. But anyway, I had them getting invented before the Civil War, and so the South has these dragoons that ride bicycles around, high wheelers around in the early stages of the war, and then the North figures out, being more industrialized and more mechanically adept, they figure out chains and wheels, and have their own bicycle dragoons running around. And
So I did a quick Google search because that's the beauty of doing this the way we record it. So the bicycle was invented in June 12th, 1817 by German Baron Karl von Drais, who called it the the running machine.
The velocity, yeah.
It was there are other subtle notable advancements in the history of bicycles was in 1866, which is what you're talking about. Pierre Lallement, I'm probably butchering again, sorry, a French patented the first pedal bicycle in the U.S. In 1866, which is what you're talking about. The big wheel design was patented in an attempt to make it more mechanical. Mm-hmm. The other one was more Fred Flintstone looking, where he was kind of pushing it with his feet, but you were still sitting on a bike. But it wasn't until we started kind of the industrialization that standardized things that it got to be, anything more than a bunch of people tinkering. Because obviously in war, you need people to get replacement parts, which is what the Civil War was known for, was revolutionary. Like, we were building weapons on an industrial scale. Mm-hmm. Whereas before that, you made each weapon by hand. You had to replace, if the pin or whatever broke, you replace it for that one, because you couldn't necessarily take the one off the other rifle. And so the standardization you talked about was 1866.
Now, the thing, once the principle, I think that the biggest thing was the principle of, pedaling with your feet. And there's actually, remember you're probably aware of the Confederate early submarine that
the Handley,
Handley. I believe, as I recall it, they propelled it by using hand things, pedaling basically with their hands. They had not, for some reason, they hadn't gotten the idea. Okay, legs are a lot stronger. So, I also, as part of that Confederate dragoon thing, I had them using the same principle in something like the Handley, and actually succeeding in blowing up a few Union ships. So
nice. So obviously, like, you've loved history. It kind of feels natural to turn that into, when you start writing, you only do that genre for the passion of it, because you're going to get two things. One, it's not always the most lucrative genre, although I love it. And two, when you talk something like history, there's always going to be that, well, actually, somebody that's going to like try to nitpick the hell out of everything. Dude, at a certain point in time, like, just have fun too, right? Like, this is not real. We're playing with timelines, so of course we can change a few things. But what made you decide, like, when you do it, do you try to go and change the natural, like, tech of the era, just a few things like the bicycle, or do you have a preference to bring in like time travel type elements to it too, because they kind of delineate between the two.
Right.
Sometimes those two factions of the genre are like butting heads.
A lot of mine are actually they're not quite standard alternate histories. They involve putting together eras in ways that one person called it bizarro history. A lot of the things I write are in a universe I call the snapshot universe, and the idea is that it's a kind of a secondary universe that emulates a alternate history in a way. The way it works is that for millions of years, back to dinosaur times, very powerful people with no aspirations to be gods, just kind of experimenting, have been creating exact copies of pieces of Earth, usually a continent size a piece. And they put it in its own artificial reality, but the things are connected like can visualize pearls on a necklace, with each of those pearls being an alternate reality. They're just of a continent. And the continents are interconnected through gates high above their oceans, so usually about 30,000 feet up. So once you have an airplane that's capable of reaching 30,000 feet, you can go from reality to reality. So so you can fly to a reality where there's still dinosaurs, or where Aztecs survived because a snapshot got taken before Columbus discovered America, or before Cortez got to Mexico. I've actually just finished a novelette where modern day mercenaries discover one of these snapshots, sort of a timeline where Aztec Empire is still there. It's had 400 or 500 years, however many years it is, and but it's still there, and nobody knows about it except for these mercenaries. So they decide to set themselves up as god kings in this evolved Aztec Empire. So, and they run into a few surprises. So let's just put it that way. So
okay, so do you, when you do this, do you just like, does the people reading it, do they know if it's true? Like, how do you tell the reader that if it's true alt history, like we changed this and then, or because I've seen one alt history, for instance, talks about like if the German the Tsar, the Kaiser, excuse me, the Tsar was Russian. If he had, the generals had listened to him when he warned about involving in World War I, for instance, and they hadn't committed, like that would have changed the whole scope of the future, right? Like that one little change. Yeah. So when you read that, they you know exactly what you're getting. How do you get the reader to know that this isn't like colloquially alt history in that way, but more?
Yeah, I've had problems with that a few times. Let's see. I had one guy insist, well, of course, Dewey was not elected president. Everybody knows that, or everybody that knows any history knows that. And I said, yeah, I know this is alternate history, but it's wrong. So I have that issue at times. I remember a time when I used to post alternate history scenarios on the internet, and they were inside of a newsletter, alternate history newsletter. And one of the things I did was a little scenario where the Pequots won their war against Massachusetts and Connecticut, and apparently some grade school teacher assigned her, one of her students, something where the poor kid stumbled across my thing about the Pequots winning, and she got very confused.
Did the teacher reach out?
Yeah, she wrote an email to me, and I was like, yeah, this is not intended as real history.
That's kind of cool though. Like,
Yeah.
At least they found it.
Yeah.
There's another alt history world that I liked that Harry Turtledove did, where it wasn't so much that they changed anything. Like Guns of the South very specifically delineates they show up at whatever point in the timeline with the AKs, and then at a certain point in time, the South can make them themselves and off to the races. He did another one where he doesn't really go into like how they won, but the South wins, and then what World War I would look like as an American front that I thought was fascinating. So, do you have a favorite era of history you like to write in, or are you not? Do you not limit yourself?
Well, I've been all over the map. The Wokuo Incursion is set in late 1937, right after the Panay incident, and but it's involves invaders from another timeline that were actually descendants of Japanese sort of pirates / smugglers who historically died out around 1600 when Japan reunified. So let's see, who was I going with that? So in any case, in this alternate reality, they didn't die out. Japan didn't unify, and actually between the Woku and the Japanese, they had an industrial revolution considerably before Europe had one historically. And as a result, they build worldwide empires and that are based on a Japanese slash with the Woku are actually the Chinese call them Japanese dwarf pirates, but they're actually genetically they were probably more Chinese. They were about 40% Japanese, 60% Chinese. I'm sorry, that's.
You're fine. Okay. So, how about this? We're going to play the commercial real quick because it sounds like we're going to start talking about the book, and then we'll spend the rest of the podcast talking about the Incursion, which is your own specific book that we're talking about. Because we've been talking more broadly until now. So with that, I'm going to air that beautiful bean footage, people.
When a young officer no longer wants to be an instrument of destruction. Sacrifices are a necessary part of leadership. Get used to having blood on your hands. And whose job is to help a warlord annihilate humankind. I will unleash this bioweapon on the galaxy. But first, I need to control her. He plays a dangerous game to escape to the warlord's greatest rival.
Hundreds of people loved her. They gave their lives for her, and she will never know.
Discover a galaxy with epic space battles, tangled loyalties, and the pursuit of freedom, sacrifice, and redemption. The Handler's Gambit by Ingrid Moon. Available wherever books are sold. And check for the audiobook coming soon.
All right. Thank you for sticking with that commercial interlude. I figured it would give you time to handle the phone situation, so it's perfect. All right. So first, the Wokuo Incursion. For those listening, what would you say the PG rating, movie rating, whatever of this book is? So if people are saying, "Hey, is my young 12-year-old likes history," would this be appropriate?
There's some pretty violent scenes. I mean, basically, the Woku, they get into a mutually assured destruction thing amongst themselves, among rival groups of Woku, and they destroy their world. I mean, to the point where there is, they wonder. One of the higher ups in one of the clans is wondering, will it ever come back? Will multicellular life survive? Because they're using things like asteroids coming in, shaped asteroids coming in, and all kinds of nukes, and the whole anything, lunar mass drivers, just anything that they can, and so they're trying to escape to our timeline, and they succeed with a fleet, but without a lot of their people. And a lot of their uh, ships are radioactive, so they absolutely have to get these people ashore before they die of radiation poisoning. So they're both refugees from their own timeline that they just destroyed, and they're also invaders because they have to get they have to have land, and they have to get their people ashore fast. So they come in. The gate that they come in on is close to the California coast, and they basically go into the basically land in California and take it over.
So why was their ships radioactive?
It was actually a deliberate tactic on the part of their enemies. They were actually using something roughly equivalent to a neutron bomb, to a series of neutron bombs to make the ships radioactive, but not kill all the. It would kill people above deck, but if they were shielded by water or enough of the deck, enough metal of the deck, they would live. But they couldn't stay in the ships because eventually well, for one thing, the whole ship was eventually going to be radioactive. So they have to get ashore, and so they're seeing, that's quite a bit of violence when you're basically destroying a world, and plus the war was a full service war, including biological warfare, and their enemy infects them with basically a time release bacteriological warfare weapon that causes people to go into uncontrollable rage, and a killing rage. And so that gets loose in California, and there are scenes where people are just really, it's almost like a zombie apocalypse in California, though there are splashes of humor in there. And does that make
absolutely. So the POV, is this told from the Japanese, the Wokuo pirates POV, or is it from the locals in 1937 California?
There are actually there are three POVs. One is from kind of at the top of or near the top of the American hierarchy. A guy that's friends with Roosevelt and gets sent on missions on his behalf. That's one of them. The other is more of a at the bottom of the ladder type of thing. There's a guy who is he used to be a bootlegger, and now he drives trucks from one place to another, and he's not quite sure what's in those trucks. But
they won't leave you alone.
No. They're trying to tell me about the great. There's a great aurora borealis going on tonight. Do you mind if I get rid of this?
No, not at all.
All right.
All right, so I muted him real quick. So he's got some technical issues on his part. Life happens. You can't really always control that. So we appreciate your patience. I do find this fascinating because, like I said, I'm a nerd for history. I like alternative history. I'm really digging the cover, so we're gonna go look at that real quick. So this cover, obviously, the skeletal hand, I'm assuming implies. Well, actually, that's interesting. That's almost humanoid.
Yeah, it's kind of a branding thing that I do for my that, and the space bats and butterflies at the top is a kind of a branding thing. They appear on all of the books, all of my alternate history books.
I really dig the ship that you got, the flying ship,
mm-hmm.
and then balance that with the lady in the what looks like Ronin, maybe samurai type armor with the sword.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not as huge up on Oriental history of any of the eras, other than in broad strokes. But like, I really do love the smaller image that's centered in the book, which looks like a picture on a wall kind of thing. It almost looks like it's pinned to like a ship wall with the map pattern.
Yeah.
Is the character on it just, selling the idea that it's about that era, or is that a specific character?
It's selling the era. It's hints at it being a Japanese and going back to that
Okay.
era, but with the ship, the flying ship being a kind of incongruous bit.
So with these invaders that come to hit California, is there anything else that has changed? Because in 1937, that's when Germany's doing its secret buildup of what? Well, that's not so secret actually, but they're doing the buildup of military technology. Peace in Our Time. No, Peace in Our Time was was Vietnam, wasn't it? The appeasement strategy was being used in Germany at the time. They hadn't invaded Poland yet. Japan was starting to go a little bonkers in China, but is it the early stages? So how much of this changes the timeline as we know it?
Well, the Wokuo, of course, they land in the middle of isolationism. I mean, the isolationism is at its height at that point, and U.S. Army is you can count the number of modern tanks on them, probably your hands and maybe your toes. The number of tanks that they built since World War One. They did have about 900 late World War One tanks. They were copies of the
British Mark IV, I think.
There were a few Mark IVs, but they mass produced a copy of the French FT-17.
Okay, that's the more rampy looking one.
It's more modern looking one. It's got a turret with either machine guns or a 37 short barrel 37 millimeter gun in it, and I forget what they called those things. They were somewhat modernized. They kept them in service into the early 30s. Then they experimented a lot with the U.S. Army went through a heavy machine gun phase through the let's cram as many machine guns into a tank as will fit. They did that in the mid to late 1930s. There's one that everybody nicknamed it the Mae West because it had two turrets facing forward. One with had a 12. It had a 50 caliber machine gun. The other one was a regular machine gun. There was one where I think they had no less than 5 machine guns sticking out at every angle. They even had it set up so that machine guns fire. They could deflect machine guns fire downward off of this thing, so that we go into trenches below the tank. I mean, but in any case, I'm getting a little out of it. The point is that the U.S. was not a serious military power at that time. They were a serious naval power. The Pacific Fleet was probably the single most, by the standards of that day, powerful fleet in the world, because the British had as many ships due to the London Naval Treaty, but they didn't have it. They had an empire to support, so it was spread out all over the world. And the Japanese didn't have their super battleships yet, and they hadn't gotten to the point where they were putting their aircraft carriers in all together and generating the kind of power that they had at Pearl Harbor and some of the places after that. at this time, the Navy had they had some pretty progressive ideas, but uh, their idea was at that time is that a battle group was 3 battleships and an aircraft carrier, and they kept that organization up until Pearl Harbor. And the aircraft carrier, the the Navy had annual exercises called I think they were called war problems. Not exactly sure. I knew it at one time. No, fleet problems. They had they would check out these ideas, and I remember reading about one of them where they had all kinds of. They had this uh, gigantic battle, simulated battle, but they couldn't get it set up so that the fleets could have their climactic Jutland style battleship duel, because those pesky aircraft carriers kept being in a position to be to intervene, basically. But in any case, yeah, so at that, and the whole thing about battleships versus aircraft carrier versus aircraft. Yes, aircraft did obsolete battleships, at least to a certain extent, but it didn't happen. It wasn't something that happened that was automatic. It took. It was a gradual process that the aircraft kept getting bigger. And better. They kept getting faster, longer range, and able to carry more ordnance. And so if in 1937 it might or might not have been true that battleships were obsolete, because the aircraft, the whole generation of aircraft to come after that, and by late 41, airplanes could sink battleships, and did it repeatedly. I mean, although there was one case in World War II, where a battleship knocked out an aircraft carrier. It was one of the German battle cruisers knocked out a British aircraft carrier off of Norway, and I think it was during the German invasion of Norway. Anyway, so.
Yeah, and that's the other thing is you could get lost in the details when you're like, well, okay, this is where everything happens, but what stays the same and because this is one of those games where it's like playing chess, but you got to see 4 or 5, sometimes 10 moves ahead, and start thinking, is this, then that, and then military technology is a race between offense and defense, but it's a this then that counter. You'd come up with the better, sharper knife, so I come up with thicker plate kind of thing. It's a back and forth race, and so once you enter something different into the mix, you change all of that, and who knows the direction things could go. I mean, because the Germans had ideas for what we would consider a modern fighter plane before they were building them. They just didn't think it was worth the investment to continue, so they went down a different track. I mean, a lot of the technology we used to put the man on the moon, the Germans were already thinking about pre-war. And so when you look at what changes and what stays the same, that can be a very interesting decision to make when you're talking old history.
Yeah, it really is. And the fact that as soon as these Wokuo come through the gate and start interacting, the technology, just seeing things, knowing things are possible, is going to change things. I mean, they recognize that. Their admiral at one point says, this is the strongest relative to the locals that will ever be, because they'll learn things. And you're talking a fleet without a country. So they don't have the manufacturing base to maintain that fleet. They can only they have workshops and things like that on the fleet that'll it makes some parts, but it's gradually they're gradually going to lose a lot of their high technology, and the locals U.S. and the other local powers are going to uh, gain, and they're going to move faster because um, they know things are possible that they didn't know were possible.
So when the Wokuo group comes in, do they by default, because they are ethnically Japanese and Chinese, are they going to join the Axis powers? Or are they going to be independent faction?
They absolutely hate the Japanese because the Japanese, the World War II Japanese, they absolutely hate them because they are a course that would have destroyed, that would have destroyed the Wokuo, that did destroy the Wokuo locally, and that basically what happened in Japan was that they had about 200 years of civil war with all kinds of clan factions, fighting one another, and adding to the complexity of it, they started. The Portuguese introduced them to gunpowder weapons, and they got very, very good at gunpowder weapons. To the point where I think I was reading somewhere that there was more firearms in Japan during that period than there were in all of Europe. So it was just, and they were pretty advanced ones. But when when one of the competitors finally beat all the others and unified Japan, one of the things he did was he wanted that to never happen again. No more 200-year civil wars. And in order to do that, he banned firearms except for his own people, and he made it stick. And I think part of it was that the Japanese by that time were so incredibly tired of war that they would have. But in any case, he re-stratified society. I mean, firearms were they meant that the knights, the skilled warriors, were not. However good they were, a peasant with a rifle could kill them, and so they part of his society rebuilding was basically re-stratifying them. They're the peasants, and there are the upper classes, and no mobility. And he did a lot of good things. The island was getting massively deforested, and he had the control. Him and his descendants had the controls to basically you will reforest it, you will leave the trees alone, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of the he did a lot of good things for the island. But from the Wokuo point of view, he took a society that was capable of doing an industrial revolution, making so much progress, and he forced it back into a medieval mode. So they absolutely hate him. They absolutely hate that society.
So what language would they have spoken? Would they have spoken Japanese?
Yes, yeah. They're ethnically very diverse, though. I mean, one of the factions is the leader of one of the factions is, if you looked at him, he's probably, you would think he was pure Irish. Yeah, that's almost stereotypically Irish. And so yeah, it's basically they destroy themselves. One of the factions comes here. There are rumors, there are hints to the book that the other faction is also here, and in at least in small numbers. And so they may be in later books fighting them up between themselves, gathering allies among the locals. It's a tricky thing because we're wherever these people settle, and they settled in California, wherever they settle, that is the most economically advanced, most scientifically advanced place on Earth. So there's a question. Okay, let's say that the U.S. succeeds in pushing them out, and they go someplace else. Well, now that is the most advanced, uh, economically, militarily, technologically place on Earth. So do you even want to push them out? You will probably want them to die, but even then, their enemies are here, and yeah, so it's a tough situation. It isn't one of these things where, like an Independence Day, where somebody is going to save the day by knocking out the ships and it all goes away. It's going to be a kind of a subtle resolution.
So the other thing to consider is 1937. We would have began building up the military for World War One, and so, excuse me, for World War Two, and there were several bases on the West Coast. So
yeah. Actually,
do you go ahead? I was going to say, does that play a factor? Because I imagine they're going to run into,
yeah,
yeah,
it's the Pacific Fleet at that time was still based in San Diego, as if I'm recalling correctly, and so there were major bases there.
Marines had a training base out there too, I remember.
Yeah. So what I have happening, I don't want to give away too much here, but how can I say it without giving?
So let's step back. So what kind of tech do they bring with them? Is it obviously their boats fly if they came here because they're coming from the future? You've got neutron bombs, you've got all of that.
Mm-hmm.
But what are they bringing with them that they're going to end up existing in the pre-World War II technology?
They have drones. They have what they call night warriors, which are like high-tech ninja types. They're one of them says that something like we're what ninjas want to be when they grow up, or something on that order. They have, of course, they have hand weapons and armor that are hand weapons that have a longer range and they're almost infinite number of shots. Armor that it can't withstand like it might hold up against a rifle bullet, but not probably a 12.5 and definitely not a one of the rapid fire anti-aircraft cannons, maybe 20 millimeter or 30 millimeter. The biggest problem that the U.S. is going to have is that they brought with them unintentionally a bioweapon that their enemies had distributed among them, and it gets loose in California. They have been racing. They discovered that the bioweapon was there, and they were racing to produce a vaccine, and they vaccinated a substantial part of their people. So part of them are immune, part of them are just they're like the people in California. They're raging psychopaths. So there's that mix, and a large part of what's going on in California is that everything collapsed because you get 80% of the people. There's some that are naturally immune, but you got 80% of the people trying to kill each other, and you can't run a society when that's happening. And the difficulty is if the U.S. sends an army there, the bacteriological weapon spreads to it. So the initial tactic is to basically block California off at the mountain pass. It is winter, so that helps a little bit, and then try to figure out some way to initially to get the have an answer to the bioweapon.
So this starts in 1937. You said when the time the two groups meet.
Mm-hmm.
So this is before World War One has officially, or excuse me, I keep saying World War One. This is before World War Two has officially kicked off. It's in the interwar.
Right. Mm-hmm.
They show up. They've disrupted everything that leads to the start of the war. So you could take this. World War II might not happen. I'm not saying it does or it doesn't, but I mean, you've changed the game completely. So what is the scope from a chronological standpoint of book one? It goes from 1937. They get there, and the book ends at when?
It doesn't get very far into the chronology. It's basically they are offloading. The U.S. has mobilized. U.S. responds by mobilizing. Basically, they do a draft for the people who were 18 or 19, very young, but just old enough to be drafted into World War One, because they still have some military experience. Now they don't have it's. At that time, it is the almost 20-year-old military experience, but they've got some. So they're drafting guys in their late 30s with military experience and trying to train up an army, because at that point the U.S. still had a minuscule army. I looked up the figures, not for 37, but even as late as 1938, they had something like I think it was like 189,000 men in the army, and by 1941 it was 1.4 million, because so there's that big of a buildup, and that low of a low.
So one of the things that becomes an issue during World War II is everyone talks about the Japanese internment camps, because there was a large Japanese population on the West Coast, because they were brought over as I think they called them coolies, the labor to build the trains. It's not my area of expertise. I haven't done a whole lot of reading on it. I know they were brought over here to build the trains to connect the coasts, and some of them stayed. Then the naval power happened, and you ended up getting, transcontinental business people. And so there was a good sized population of people of ethnically Japanese on the West Coast.
And ethnically Chinese, yeah. Both, yeah.
Right. Now, when these people come up and they have a problem, the Wokuo invaders, they have a problem with the Imperial Japanese. How do they react to the local Oriental population?
I haven't really gotten into that all that much. It's something that I undoubtedly will have to in later books. I do have one incident where where there's a Japanese character who gets assaulted because of the Panay incident, but that's about the only thing I have really in there about the Japanese population. I acknowledge that they're there. Basically, the Wokuo think that they can put agents ashore, and they don't really have to worry about them looking Japanese, because there's a large enough Japanese population in the area that they should fit in. They discover that isn't quite the case, because there is some discrimination and some dislike of Japanese people going on there.
So one of the difficult things when you're talking about alt history is they talked differently than we would colloquially.
Yes.
Sometimes that is played up for movies, but there's definitely a different syntax, I guess, and the way they spoke different. It's like the difference between then and now in America is like the difference now in America to now in Australia, which is different from the English, which is like the Canadian. Like all of them theoretically the same language, but there's differences. So how do you address that when you're writing in this era?
I try to have little bits of flavor of the phrases, but I try not to use too much because, just the same way that you don't actually when you have people when you're setting something in England of the let's say 1500s, you don't speak in 1500 English. You give just little hints of little flavors of it. But if you tried to do it entirely in the English of that era, it'd be very difficult to understand. So, like I say, just a few words and phrases, and some of those I picked up from elderly uncles and that sort of thing. So I tossed a few things that my uncle or grandfather would say in there.
By Stars and Garters. All right, so this is obviously going to be part of a series. How long do you foresee the Wokuo Incursion series being?
I don't know if I'm going to be honest here. A lot depends on how well it sells. I mean, there's going to be. I'm going to finish a series, and there's going to be at least 3 books in it. If it sells well and people want more, and there's more to say in the story, then it could go considerably longer. I think a little bit about the background of this of the book. Chris Nuttall, I think you've done an interview with him, I believe.
I've done one on my podcast. He doesn't come on podcast. I've done a blog interview of him.
Yeah. Well,
he's a very reclusive guy.
I'm sorry, what?
He's a very reclusive guy. I dig that.
He's also a mixture. He's also a member of my. I edit a kind of a zine collective / writers critique group called Point of Divergence, and it's like we do a collective issue every 4 or 5 times a year. Well, he's also in that, and this originated with us talking about how can we make an alternate history analog to Harry Potter, something that would break out of the mainstream while still being alternate history. And we discussed it and came up with some ideas. And we started out with trying to do a collaboration, but he writes so fast, and we had somewhat different ideas. So he came out with something in modern day. It was a modern day timeline invasion called, I think, Conquistadors. He just came out with it about 3 or 4 days before I came up with a Wokuo invasion. And I decided to go with a Wokuo invasion, different time period. And in any case, if you know much about Chris, he is extremely fast writer. And if he was doing Wokuo Incursion rather, it would probably be a 10-12 book series, and it would be done. He would probably be done with all 12 of them by sometime next year. The guy's pretty amazing. But in any case, I guess I'm kind of meandering there, but I'd say it's going to be at least 3 books, and it could be considerably longer because there's a lot of potential there. The characters of World War II that were part of World War II are still there, and they're going to be reacting to this new development. The enemy of this group of Wokuo that came to the West Coast, they're going to be stirring up trouble. They aren't here in force, but they are quite capable of influencing governments, giving giving them technology, all that sort of thing. So it's going to be kind of it's going to be not the World War II that that we have, but it's going to have the same players: Hitler, Stalin, Churchill, Roosevelt. How are they going to play out in an entirely different scenario?
Okay. There's a lot of interesting characters. You're right about World War II that would be interesting, like Commander William Augustus Lee. They called him Ching Lee, which I mean, it's because he had a squint, so it was a derogatory. Well, it wasn't meant to be derogatory then, but the term most would consider racist now. Mm-hmm. But like he's already in 1937 modernizing modern naval gunnery with like making it more precise. He basically was a pistol and rifle marksman, sniper level skills, even though he was considered technically too blind to join the military. And he decided at some point, like, why couldn't we apply that to the big guns? Yeah. So all these things are going to be changing. You still have Patton and Eisenhower and Halsey and all the Nimitz, all the names everybody knows are still around.
MacArthur.
So MacArthur.
Yeah. I can tell your blood pressure rose a little bit.
Yeah, it's but all those people are there. You can because you've changed at that point. There's a lot of places they could go to get interesting. Mm-hmm. There's that famous the class at West Point that had all the stars that were generals during World War II was the class of 18, I think. They call it anyway. There's a lot of famous generals that came out of that era that would just be rising to their top position in military leadership. And then most people that have combat experience, other than the old timers from World War I, would have been in the Asiatic campaigns where they're like pacifying the Philippines against the guerrilla soldiers, or South America. And so I even though they've got combat experience, they're going to have to learn to figure out how to take what they learned and apply it usefully. And it's not going to be as easy. I mean, there's a reason after the global war on terror ended with the pulling officially, obviously semantics, pulling out of Iraq and Afghanistan, where the military said, maybe we should worry about fighting another major military power instead of pacifying regions again, because that's a skill set we don't have anymore. The same is going to be true when you look at this transitional period. And then whatever tactics you have the Wokuo using are going to affect that as well. So is that something you put a lot of thought into as far as like what military strategies these invaders are going to use, and then how that's going to affect modern-ish World War II era soldiers?
I've actually thought more about economic impacts, social impacts, but to a certain extent, I mean, there's going to be there's going to be kind of some of the trends are going to happen anyway. I mean, aircraft carriers are going to come into their own, although even they are going to be really obsolete compared to. I mean, if you have ships that can fly, and and we're talking not little ones, we're talking battleship type ships.
It's almost like the flagship Yamamoto series, where the old World War II ships flying.
Yeah, so I'm not familiar with that, but yeah, you got. Why would you even worry? Why would you even build an aircraft carrier when? What kind of weapons would be inspired by that? It's a whole different the mindset. I mean, do you go straight?
They have individual fighters, or is it going to be from the smaller ships, like so for like the dogfight type deal, or would that not be necessary at a certain point?
Yeah, or do they go straight to building like orbital bombardment weapons? I mean, they have the technology, and how do you? One of the problems that I'm having is that you can't really counter that. I mean, orbital. If they can put an orbital bombardment weapon up there, if they can use neutron bombs, World War II technology is got to come a long ways to match that.
Then you run into, well, what can they produce locally? Can they go back and forth to home, or is their home completely dead to them?
Home is completely dead. Yeah.
What other portals can they go through to, gate hop essentially?
Yeah.
For supplies and technology. Presumably, if they gate hop to a different one, they might be the underdog.
Exactly. Yeah. The way I set it up, this group, the group that landed in California, they're pretty much stuck there. They created a gate. They don't have the ability to create another one in the foreseeable future. They're going to have to rebuild their technology. And one of the problems that with rebuilding their technology is they're going to have to use at least some locals. And once they start using locals, the technology, at least parts of it, are going to they're going to grow feet. Yeah.
The other part you're going to run into is the generational loss of knowledge, as the kids of the ones that came aren't going to have that same knowledge. Or the other example I use a lot is, just because you can drive an automobile doesn't mean you understand how an combustion engine works.
Right.
And so just because they can use it doesn't mean they can necessarily build it. So it's the Destroyer Man series. I can't remember who wrote that, but we interviewed that author, and he mentioned the same thing: is, what can you source locally? What can you build yourself? Because I mean, that is the crux of it, is if you can't build the parts. Like, I couldn't go back to medieval Europe and suddenly have them build a computer for me.
No.
They'd have to gradually. You'd still need the Industrial Revolution to increase ability, first this, then that, to get there. It obviously would happen considerably faster if you know all the steps, but you'd still have to get there to build the infrastructure. And so they're going to run into the same kind of problem.
Yeah, to a certain extent. Now they do have computer databases and artificial intelligences that can do some of that stuff for them. But knowledge is really tough to retain. I mean, you look at how long was it between the time we stopped producing the Saturn V rockets and the time that it would have taken an awful lot of work to recreate that technology.
Yeah, and then you reach a certain point where what's old is new again. They're talking about bringing back the battleships and reactivating them. So it's technology is weird like that. I don't know. Do they establish proper borders when they land at a certain point where, like, we're claiming this is our territory, or is it in this book, is it constantly in flux?
They basically set up along the Rocky Mountain passes around on the borders of California. And they claim that that they're doing that to keep the bacteriological warfare stuff from spreading to the rest of the country. But de facto, California they're saying it's their territory.
And the other part of that is, what good is blocking the maritime passes if you got a boat that can fly over the mountains?
Yeah, exactly.
So I know it's an interesting question, because at this time the American capability is very two-dimensional, and they're fighting in a three-dimensional space now.
Mm-hmm. And they're not necessarily. Oh, go ahead.
No, it's an interesting conundrum to throw the average Joe into.
Yeah, there's also the issue that they can make the average American's life a lot better if they so choose. And yeah, they would like their goal really is to make us junior allies. That's not going to happen very easily, at least, because they just took one of our states. We don't.
Right.
That's not a good start to the relationship.
Do they allow refugees out if they don't want to stay?
they can't do that because they are at least not
Oh, because
initially
of the
because of
bacteria.
the bacteriological thing. I think that yeah, they probably would, yeah, if they once they get everybody vaccinated. Uh, but yeah, what they really wanted, I mean, ideally, the whole bacteriological thing is a downside for them. They really wanted to take the state intact, and they one of the things that they've got enough ability to understand political systems and manipulate them that they probably could have taken over the state government with California government uh, without more than a few shots fired. Yeah, they're just sophisticated enough in figuring out who's who. What do we need? What does this person want? What does this person want to not have become public? That sort of thing. Uh, and that was
So
their.
I was gonna say, so given that you have them so overpowered compared to the American military, well, the global military, really,
Mhm.
when they land, how do you counter that in a way to keep the tension? Because it'd be too easy just to make them Mary Sue's because, like,
Yeah,
they're
and that's
basically us,
well. There are some
essentially.
things. Uh, they're overpowered militarily, at least initially, but they also are very close to starvation and dehydration because the ships have desalinization units on them. Some of them do, but some of them don't. Some of the civilian ones don't, and they have some of the ships are radioactive. They have to. They're going to have a great deal of trouble feeding themselves and keeping themselves alive, keeping themselves from dehydration initially. Plus, they have a considerable part of their population that's also influenced by this bacteriological uh, warfare thing. So they're raging, they're homicidally enraged and trying to kill each other. Uh, so they have their own problems. Um,
Okay. Obviously, we don't want spoilers. So, is there anything about this series? Because I'm already intrigued. One, are they going to be doing audiobooks? Are you going to be doing audiobooks?
uh, in all likelihood, yeah, yeah.
Did you publish this, or is this through a small press or
I
Shroud Pub
published.
or what?
I published it.
Okay.
Yeah,
So, at some point in time, potentially audiobooks.
yeah.
Obviously, this is a series. Is there anything about the Wokuo Incursion that we didn't talk about that you think we should know before we wrap this up? Because we're getting dangerously close to my curiosity leading us into spoiler territory.
Okay. uh, not. I think we covered pretty much what it's about. It's I mean, the Woku are initially really overpowered in that they have so many ways of influence that are even non-military ones, like oh, we can cure polio. We can cure yeah, and you realize that Roosevelt was trapped. He was a victim of polio. Couldn't walk, so that's going to be a little tempting. They're going to have they have the ability to go to a manufacturer and say, "Could you make this for us?" And this would be something that would give them enormous profits, enormous market share, and so they have all sorts of non-military things that they can do to kind of subvert any attempt to um, to kick them out. And the bottom line is, if you succeed in kicking them out and they go somewhere else, that somewhere else becomes as I think I mentioned this before, it becomes the center uh, of technological and industrial power in the world. So you don't want to kick them out and have them go to Germany, for example. Or to
Now with what's going on in Germany in 1937.
yeah. So yeah, but their power will diminish because they can't build a lot of the stuff that they depend on, and they also have their enemies that they fought in their own timeline. They do have people lurking here trying to stir up issues, and they have a lot of capability too. So
Okay. When is the next book coming out?
oh. I wish I could give you a deadline, but it's probably going to be sometime in the spring of 2025.
Okay. I imagine there's a lot more research in this genre, which is why I don't write it, than say space pew pews where you make it all up.
I had a guy leave kind of a nasty review of one of my novels because I had people using an M1 carbine, and the thing was set in about a year before the M1 carbine came out. The M1 was out, but the M1 carbine was not. So, I knew that, but my mind kind of glitched because I was also almost simultaneously writing something that was set in 1942. So that's the sort of thing you run into.
Yeah, but you could also, they could have modified it really easily. So if you're already changing things, what's the carbine coming out at the same time as the rifle? Like, why not? Yeah. I mean, the technology is the same. There's very little difference between a carbine and a regular rifle except for size,
right?
The length and such. So, I don't know. That's not as hard to sell as some of the other things that people can do. Okay. So are you actually working on the second novel now, or are you on one of your other series?
Actually, I'm trying to finish up another series and the novella I was mentioning with the mercenaries. I trying to become God Kings of the Aztecs. Once I get those done, then probably the Wokuo Incursion would be the next in line.
Okay. And so if they wanted to follow you on the wild interwebs, as usual, all the links will be in the show notes. But where are you most active online that they could follow you and get your stuff?
Probably most active in the on the WordPress blog.
Okay. So this is the part, dear listener, where I remind you to please be kind and speak your mind on the reviewing platforms. Your reviews help the right readers find the right books. So do your part. Are your books wide or are they Amazon exclusives?
The ebooks are Amazon exclusive. Most of them. I'm going to start gradually moving away from that, but there are some advantages to it. But you can get the paperbacks pretty much anywhere. Although the paperback for Wokuo is not out yet. That's one of my next projects is to get that out.
Okay. And where you said they can find you on your blog, which will be linked, you can find us, dear listener, at our link tree. linktr.ee linktree/Blasters and Blades podcast. Again, linktree/Blasters and Blades podcast, where we link to all the things, the BitChutes, the Rumbles, the YouTubes, the TikToks, the Twitters. We have our Blasters and Blades Facebook group and Facebook page. We have our email, Blasters and Blades podcast at gmail.com. Again, Blasters and Blades podcast at gmail.com. For professional purposes only, people, we have our shenanigans are all safe for Matt and Stabby Stab on the Instagram, Twitter, and the email. Links in the link tree. We have our website over there on Spotify. Bunch of gobbledygook. Just go to the link tree. It's easier. Trust me. When you get there, you can help support the show for as little as 99 cents a month. You can help keep the lights on. And we do appreciate your patronage. These episodes are not free to produce. You could support the show more directly over at buymeacoffee.com/author J.R. Handley. Again, buymeacoffee.com/author J.R. Handley. Be sure to put in the comment section that's for the podcast. And I promise I will keep my co-hosts duly caffeinated. They will drink until they are floating away on a river of goodness of Java and coffee. It'll be delicious. And I wonder if the Java man, circling back to the beginning that we mentioned earlier, if he also liked the coffee. Things that make you go, All right. And we appreciate it. So with that, thank you for spending some of your precious time with us. For my absentee co-host, I am J.R. Handley, and this was the Blasters and Blades podcast. We'll be back next week at the same time, where we'll indulge our love of nerd culture, cheesy jokes, and all things that go boom. All right, thanks for coming on. I try to rein in our nerdiness a little bit. I mean, at almost 2 hours in, I guess I didn't do the greatest of jobs, but I had fun. You had fun. We'll hope everyone else had fun too.
Yeah.
And I'm definitely going to have to check this book out when it comes out in audiobook, because I am definitely interested. We appreciate you coming on.
Okay.
And we'll have to have you back again for a panel on alt history in the not too distant future. That's in our plans for 2025.
Yep. Keep me in mind.
All right. With that, I will hit the end button, people. Wait for it. Wait for it. Nope, don't cuss.